It's a great pleasure to have great speakers with us, Mr. Sikorski, Mr. Freudenstein. We're really pleased that you have joined us for this webinar. I'd like to start with a short quote. In November 2011, Minister Sikorski said in Berlin, "I fear Germany's power less than her inactivity." That statement was, of course, not something obvious for a lot of people in Poland and Germany and beyond. How do you both see today Germany's role in the EU, and what is your assessment of bilateral Polish-German relations? Is the Weimar Triangle formula dead? Minister Sikorski.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for reminding me of my speech. You might have added that it earned me a motion of no confidence from the then right-wing opposition today in government, which we comfortably defeated, and which I think has stood the test of time, because Germany is being urged from all sides, in fact, to do more. And if my reading of Chancellor Merkel's statement on the beginning of the German presidency is anything to go by, Germany is promising to do more. But the fact that we are having a debate on German-Polish relations at the AJC also suggests that not everything is hunky-dory. And of course, as you know, there's a lot of history between us, and there are also some competing interests. On the one hand, Germany is Poland's biggest trading partner. Poland is pretty important for Germany as well, bigger than Russia. Most Germans don't realize that. We have over 100,000 Polish-German marriages, and they are more solid than German-German marriages or Polish-Polish marriages. We share an interest in the eastern flank of both the EU and of NATO, although we have a different perspective. Germany is surrounded by friendly states and is not spending as much proportionately on defense as Poland. Poland borders on Belarus and Russia, and is providing security to Germany. We are Germany's tank mine, if you like. And we also have criticized German decisions, such as building the pipeline across the Baltic, which the United States has now stopped by imposing sanctions on companies that were building that project. Germany chose its economic interest to be a major hub for the distribution of gas in Europe over all of Europe's strategic interest, which is to strengthen the transit countries, both member states such as Slovakia, Czech Republic and Poland, but also associate members such as Ukraine. We now have a very interesting discussion coming up at the European Council, where actually Poland is, I think, going to back Germany on financing of the huge package of assistance for the transformation of the European economy through the European Union's new taxes. There's going to be a grand bargain between Germany and France on the one hand, and the northern states and the southern states on the other. So there are good things to be said. Despite the rhetoric on the nationalist side in both countries, the relationship is pretty solid, even though we have a divisive political campaign in Poland now, in which the German card is again being used.
Thank you so much. Mr. Freudenstein, Poland, Germany, the EU, the Weimar Triangle. You're muted.
The Weimar Triangle. Yes, I once called the Sorbonne University in Paris and asked them whether they can recommend me an expert on Weimar Triangle politics, and they said, well, if you're talking about the politics of 1920s Germany, you've got to go to this and that person. Weimar Triangle is not really, still, I would claim, not a sizable point of French politics and French debates. But coming back to your question, I think it's hard to disagree with what Radek Sikorski has said. That speech, by the way, in 2011 in Berlin was a breakthrough. That was a watershed moment. Also in the German debate about German-Polish relations, because I think it transported the debate away from an overly historical focus and put it into the 21st century, I would say. So, what is happening at the moment? It's true that German and Polish nationalists are at loggerheads, but the Polish nationalists are in government and the German nationalists are firmly locked in opposition. That does make a difference. I wouldn't like to imagine what Polish-German relations could be like if they were in power in Germany as well. But then who would like to imagine a Europe with nationalists in power in Berlin? So I think, indeed, the actual cooperation on the ground is better than what the rhetoric of the government in Warsaw makes it look like, and also better than what, let's say, some German commentators have to say about the conservatism of Polish society, the Atlanticism of Polish political culture, not just of the current government. I mean, all these are things where there is much to criticize in German commentary as well. But I want to return to the main point. The fact that the German government is perfectly aware of the historical complexities of German-Polish relations is a plus. And the fact that for that reason, the German government has long ago decided not to respond in kind whenever Polish politicians from Law and Justice, from the governing party, use the anti-German card for domestic purposes, I think is a blessing. So having said that, I am far from claiming that no mistakes were made in German foreign policy in the last 10 years. Indeed, Nord Stream 2, I think, is the biggest geopolitical blunder by the German government, and indeed, initially born by a large consensus in the political spectrum. And that was definitely something that should never have happened, because indeed, for the reasons that Alex Sikorski also already outlined, so I don't have to go into detail here. I would like to pick out a second point where I'm critical of the German government, and that was the decision in 2015, but also the way that the decision was taken about keeping the borders open to uncontrolled mass migration in the autumn of 2015. And when I say the way the decision was taken, what I mean is that there was no consultation whatsoever with any other government in Europe, let alone with the Central European governments. And it should have been obvious at the time that there were particular sensitivities in those societies, even if they were not exactly, let's say, in the hotspots of the uncontrolled mass migration. But this, why am I spending so much time on this? Because at that time, I believe, a Polish-German culture war, which had been brewing for some time, because these two societies are very different, and they're conservative in very different ways, because that was brought to the open and has has been very, very active ever since. You know, I mean, if our imperialism in the past used to come in military boots, today it comes in Birkenstock sandals, as a German op-ed writer once said. And there is something to this. And again, this culture war between, let's say, the center of gravity of German society and the center of gravity of Polish society, this concerns more than just the ruling parties. This is a broad difference about certain questions of how society should be structured, what the values are. And here I miss some sensitivity from the German side. But again, just last sentence, I think that the main problem at the moment is that the government in Warsaw is playing the German card for domestic purposes. By the way, this is nothing new. I mean, I remember from my time as the director of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation office in Warsaw, how Polish nationalists were already doing this in the 1990s. And in fact, before '89, the communists had been doing it for a long time. So there is some unfortunate tradition there. And in this case, it's a blessing that this has never really worked on the German side. I mean, you do not play the anti-Polish card in Germany to achieve electoral advantage in German elections. And so the glass is half full rather than half empty, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freudenstein, and thank you, Minister Sikorski. If I
May I come back on this?
Very briefly.
Yeah, I agree with you on the migration, and I think it helped to throw the election to Kaczynski and the nationalists in 2015. You should have done what we should have done at the beginning of the pandemic, which is to call for an emergency summit of the Schengen Group, which is responsible for managing external border and internal borders in the EU. And you didn't do it then. Poland didn't do it in March this year before slamming the doors shut. Weimar Triangle, I didn't refer to it, is Poland's entry into the decision-making center of the EU, and I'm very disappointed that the current Polish government has not kept up this formula. We also had something called the Kaliningrad Triangle, which gave us a direct insight into the relationship between Germany and Russia, and which was very useful and helpful, I think, to all three sides. And that hasn't been kept up either. A great pity.
Thank you. I would like to circle back a bit. I mean, both of you already touched upon the issue of Russia. And Mr. Freudenstein, you just said that the German government knows about the historical importance of and the historical sensibilities on the Polish side. But I fear we don't have the sensibilities when we're looking at the broader society. And I mean, one of the major issues is how to manage Russia's foreign policy, Russia's aggression in Eastern Europe. And of course, Nord Stream 2 is of particular importance. The German government to this day insists that this is a purely private undertaking, no geopolitical implications. And maybe, Mr. Freudenstein, when you can start answering, can you maybe explain how this resonates in Poland, having Berlin and Moscow agree on something, not consulting with Warsaw, and what, you know, the historical, how this historically resonates in the Polish society?
Terribly, for completely understandable reasons. Now, look, as I said, the German historical sensitivity in the case of Russia, as opposed to or next to Poland and other Central European countries, there's a problem that there are competing historical sensitivities, I would say. I think there's in my view, completely false historic sensitivity in the case of German-Russian relations. I remember when I was just in Warsaw when the financial crisis erupted in 1998. And it was this German expellee refugee organization still making demands on Poland for the expulsions of 1944, 45, and so on. And they said they kept sending me their leaflets or some kind of news bulletin. And I remember that in the case of this financial crash, it was full of anti-Polish propaganda. But in the case of Russia, they say we now have to help the Russian people, which has been generous to us, and so on in the past. I mean, okay, not all German nationalists would talk like that, but there was a very significant moment when faced with choosing between which Eastern neighbor you prioritize, there was a choice made in favor of Russia. I'm afraid that this is made by more than this, just this one rag that was formulated, that was written produced in the 1990s. And Russia certainly very deftly utilizes this historical sensitivity and keeps rubbing it in. I think that, you know, there are lots of conference formats and regular seminars and meetings in a bilateral German-Russian context. And I think this is so wrong for two reasons. I mean, like, for example, the St. Petersburg dialogue, which is allegedly civil society. Well, from the Russian side, there is no civil society represented there. These are all government-operated NGOs, gongos. But anyway, what is so wrong with this bilateral German-Russian dialogue? Two things. First, it opens the way for the Russians to morally blackmail the Germans forever, because they only have to say 1945. And the Germans will not be able to discuss on the same level of value-based politics that they would be able to discuss with other nations. And the other thing that happens is, of course, it sends a terrible signal to the countries situated in between Germany and Russia or elsewhere in Europe, but part of the so-called bloodlands, as Tim Snyder would call them, countries that were particularly affected by German or Russian aggression, or Soviet aggression, of course, in the last 100 years. So, there is, I mean, there's lots of psychological and cultural reasons why there is such a sometimes preference for Russia and Russian sensitivities at the cost of sensitivities in Northeastern, Central Europe and Southeastern Europe. And I can't go into all these details, but let me just emphasize here that there is such a competition, and unfortunately, the immorality of prioritizing Russia in this, because Russia has for such a long time and so consistently been the aggressor, at one point even together with Germany, Molotov-Ribbentrop, you know, that all this is somehow not present enough in an otherwise very history-conscious discourse in the German public and the German elite. But in this case, in the case of Nord Stream 2, for example, or also in this hesitation to actually name, shame, and call out Russian aggression against Ukraine, there was such a hesitation at some point in 2014. So in all this, I see a false lesson from history, a false, an erroneous sensitivity vis-a-vis Russia, which actually shouldn't be there, not towards this kind of action from the Russian side.
Thank you. And Minister Sikorski, I would like to pose the same question to you, and maybe you can also elaborate a little bit more on why, viewed from Warsaw, also for our viewers in the US and Germany, why this project is a problem, and how it is viewed and in Poland, and what are the strategic implications are.
I've mentioned one aspect of it already. Another one is that even though Poland is closer to the sources of the gas, we pay more than Germany does. So being able to deliver directly to Germany without using the Yamal pipeline through Poland gives Russia a quasi-monopolistic ability to impose higher prices, which is unfair. We also fear that Russia might one day do what she's done before, which is cutting off the gas in the middle of winter, which is what Russia did to Ukraine in the 2000s. But this has now stopped, and Russia is out of pocket by $10 billion over Nord Stream 2. I'd like to pick up on Roland's reference to the expellees organization, because there's one amusing aspect of them. Germans were expelled from Poland, Pomerania, Silesia, and Poland's 1/3 of East Prussia. They were also expelled from the northern 2/3 of East Prussia. But the expellees organizations never, ever demand any restitutions from Russia. Interesting, isn't it? But I think what underlies it is that the Germans have had it drummed into them, the enormity of their crimes in the former Soviet Union and in the Holocaust. But there is a lack of knowledge about what went on in Poland from the first day of the war. And also, sorry, this might sound rude, but I'll say it anyway, the Germans got really well whacked by the Soviet Union, and that breeds certain respect. And they, don't have those same feelings towards Poland. And lastly, remember, the Germans are geostrategically ambivalent. They still feel certain gratitude to the United States for saving them from Stalinism, but anti-Americanism underneath is pretty lively. And according to Pew Research opinion polls, 1/3 of Germans think that their country should be in alliance with Russia against the United States.
Yeah, but in alliance with Russia maybe, but not with Putin. Putin has an approval rate of 8% in Germany, which is still too high, but it would be a different Russia. But you're right. I mean, there are anti-Americanism and a general feeling that dates from the Wilhelminian period, actually, before World War I, that is very strong. A cultural affinity with Russia. Russia is the noble savage or something like this. And Germany of that time, like 120 years ago, actually felt truly a latecomer to the world stage, like Tsarist Russia in a way at the time was an anti-status quo power, whereas with Britain and France, and then later on the United States were considered the status quo powers, and they also happened to be liberal democracies in those days. So I mean, this is one factor which explains things like Nord Stream 2, things like the initial hesitation in 2014 to slap on sanctions on Russia. But I mean, at this point, I would also like to emphasize that without Angela Merkel, these sanctions in their current form would have hardly come into being, and certainly wouldn't have been upheld until today and rolled over at each European summit every 6 months. So okay, but having said this anti-Americanism is an interesting point. I would go further, and I would say that in German public discourse, that majority opinion has drawn the wrong lessons from World War II, basically. Namely, that, that using military force is something that cannot be done for a good purpose. So it is to be avoided almost at all cost, unless you actually defend your own existence. But the fact that this could actually entail resisting aggression by an actor like Putin's Russia in other places is still an unpopular idea for many, many Germans. I wouldn't say for the vast majority, because I think there is some support in society, for example, for German troops in Lithuania these days, and they are clearly there to defend that country as a NATO ally. But it is something that is questioned by a high number of Germans. And the reason for that questioning is what I would say, drawing the wrong lessons from history, namely that military power is considered evil by itself, instead of saying that military power is sometimes necessary to put aggressive dictators in check. And you know, in 2003, by the way, lots of the things that we can observe today between Germany and Poland about the Transatlantic alliance, about the relationship to the United States and so on, to me, it's a deja vu of 2003 about the Iraq War, when Germany and Poland were at on completely different sides in Europe, actually worse than today, I would say. When, you know, the German Chancellor, Mr. Schröder, was in public cahoots with French President Chirac and Vladimir Putin from Russia, whereas Poland was a staunch ally of the United States, like at the time Britain and most of Central Europe, by the way. So, you know, I mean, these splits are nothing entirely new, and there are some deep psychological explanations for them. I think that the challenge for the future will be to actually get back on the same side and remember that, hey, we are allies in NATO, we are partners in the European Union, we have a huge amount of common interests, and they are much, much more important than what may divide the current governments.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Freudenstein, Mr. Sikorski. The next question, you have both actually alluded to the American aspect of the discussion and the transatlantic perspective, and that's something we really want to address in this webinar, including the military power. So there are plans, we've heard that there are plans for the US to withdraw close to 10,000 troops from Germany, and Poland, again, that we heard from the Polish president, would be ready if that decision, US decision, is implemented. Poland would be ready to receive part of that contingent. My question would be, again, to both of you, are bilateral Polish-US and German-US relations a zero-sum game now? And having a broader European perspective in mind, in the near future, do you see any prospects for a closer Polish-German cooperation in order to fix the troubled transatlantic relationship? Minister Sikorski?
Well, the military side is really fascinating because Polish politicians often don't know how much is happening in the Polish-German military relationship. I remember when I was foreign minister, the then leader of the opposition said, we won't agree to German troops being on the Polish soil anytime soon. And I couldn't believe what he was saying, because we already had German troops on our soil. You know, the Corps Command in Szczecin and various exercises. In fact, Poland has about the same number of Leopard tanks as Germany, and they have already exercised the Polish tank brigade under a German general, and the German tank brigade are under a Polish general. In terms of numbers of exercises, we do far more with Germany than with the United States. And some politicians also don't appreciate the fact that Poland and Germany are one strategic space. You cannot defend Poland without transiting from Rotterdam and Hamburg via Germany. The delivery of assistance to Poland via the Scandinavian Straits and the Baltic is impracticable. So Poland needs to have a minimally good relationship with Germany for the American assistance to arrive in Poland at all. To give credit to President Duda, where credit is due, when he went to Washington recently, he did say publicly, he appealed to President Trump not to withdraw troops from Europe. Yes, Poland would receive American troops from wherever they come. I personally appealed for 2 heavy brigades. But I think the reality is going to be that if the Pentagon withdraws anything from Germany, most of it will be deployed to Asia. Because the organizing competition of the 21st century for the United States is not going to be with Russia, but with China. And therefore, Polish politicians should be very careful what they wish for, because it is not a zero-sum game. And I would also put to Roland that the solution to your historical conundrum, which is capable of being active again, namely, if Germany really started to spend 2 or 3% of GDP on its armed forces, wait and see what we would immediately start hearing, right? So the solution to your problem is to strengthen European defense, capable of being used on both the southern flank and the eastern flank. And I'm disappointed that because of this COVID pandemic and the economic crisis that is looming, we will probably not increase the size of the European defense budget as much as it should be increased for longer term reasons.
Right. Let me play the Atlanticist here. That's a new one. Talking to Radek Sikorski and playing the Atlanticist. No, I'm all in favor of European defense cooperation, but a territorial defense, including deterrence on all its levels, from hybrid to conventional to tactical nuclear to strategic nuclear. I mean, all this we will not have for a very long time to come on the EU level. And that is not even because of what America does or doesn't do. It is simply because in Europe, if Europe is left to itself, and this would be continental Europe, of course, after Brexit, you know, the question where you stand on security depends on where you sit geographically. And if you do not have a moderating elite nation like the United States in NATO, it is extremely difficult to organize defense and deterrence on all these levels in an EU context. Now that, as I said, doesn't mean that Europeans shouldn't do anything. And it certainly also doesn't mean that Europeans shouldn't increase their intervention capacity in the neighborhood. And for the foreseeable future, that means the southern and southeastern neighborhood. All these things are totally necessary, they're possible, and they're unfortunately not sufficiently done at the moment. However, I return to my main point. I do not think that the EU can replace what NATO is doing at the moment in terms of deterring potential aggressors such as Russia. So, I mean, having I totally agree.
It cannot, but it's not even trying. And it's very irresponsible, I think, because if the Americans mismanage their relationship with China and the competition turns hot, the first thing they'll do is to withdraw their forces from Europe, and then we'll be in real trouble. And the reason we're not doing more is not because we can't, but because there's no leadership.
Thank you both. We're going to have one more question, again, to both of you. And this is about Poland's double role, actually, its role in the European Union and its role, or potential roles in both cases, and its role in NATO and building, strengthening the transatlantic partnership. So we are used to thinking that Poland is the leader of Central and Eastern Europe in the European Union, as the biggest economy and the biggest population country among the still so-called new EU members. What do you think is Poland's potential as a player in Brussels, but specifically when it comes to fixing the EU's relationship with Washington? Mr. Freudenstein, this time, please.
Right. Well, I think at the moment, Poland is punching under its weight in several senses. Maybe let's start with rhetoric and with the verbalization of policies. And let's contrast Poland with Hungary, the nation that seems to be the leader and has actually become the spokesman or the cheerleader of the Visegrad group of 4 countries, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Czechia. So, I mean, Viktor Orban is way more savvy, and I mean, he speaks English. He's got a sense of humor, but both of which are things that Kaczynski probably doesn't have. I just imagine the horror scenario for me would be if someone like Viktor Orban would lead a heavyweight like Poland. That would actually be a nightmare then. Why? Because, of course, Poland is trying, and here's a difference to Hungary, by the way. Poland is trying to be the transatlantic good boy with whoever is in power in Washington. And even at the cost of European defense cooperation and let's say a deep partnership with Germany and France. That's the current Polish government. I shouldn't say Poland, I should say the current Polish government. But having said that, what else is the Polish government doing in Brussels today? It's picking fights with the European Commission and the European Parliament over the rule of law, you know, because it is actually severely undermining the independence of the judiciary in Poland. I mean, all these are completely superfluous and not only dangerous for Polish democracy, but also completely unnecessary fights that are picked with Brussels, quote unquote, which of course in the propaganda of the Polish and the Hungarian government is kind of the old decadent rich West European elites that have long ago lost their right to lecture anyone in Central Europe about democracy. I mean, so this is what is going on now. Instead of playing a constructive role and actually bringing good people into high positions in Brussels, all of which would definitely be in the reach of a heavyweight, as I said, like Poland, and all this is not happening, whereas what is happening are these unnecessary conflicts.
You're muted, Sebastian. Sebastian, you're muted.
Minister Sikorski, now your turn, specifically that you're based or spend probably half of your time in Brussels seeing things up close.
I agree with Roland, you know, but I think it's an imminent nature of nationalism. Poland's claim to be in the big league with the big boys is as a representative of its region, not just on its own. But if you proclaim far and wide that you are a nationalist and only the national interest matters, then why should others trust you to represent their interests? So, you know, it's in many ways that nationalism harms the nation, including in its diplomatic weight, in its diplomatic power to convince. You know, Poland's role, usefulness to Germany and France is as a country that can bring together its region and then simplify decision making by representing the interests of the new member states, if you like. But you know, the Visegrad group isn't working too well either. Look, you've asked me not to become too political, but as Roland was saying, you know, we used to appoint Polish diplomats to be ambassadors to Kiev, you know, head of NATO office to Moscow, you know, important posts for us. We used to get the EU as a whole to adopt a Polish idea, the Eastern Partnership. I can't think of any such thing that Poland has managed to persuade Europe to do recently.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sikorski. Thank you, Mr. Freudenstein. So being mindful of the time, we're now going to transition to questions from the audience. And Eric, I guess you have some questions.
Sure. First, a reminder to our audience that you can submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our first question is from AJC CEO David Harris. Two parts. First, his question to Radek. What's the Russian strategy in trying to rewrite World War II's history to single out Poland as largely responsible for the war's outbreak? And to Roland, has Germany done everything possible, in your view, to push back against Moscow's revisionist history?
Well, President Putin has gone through various phases. When Poland joined the EU, he was told, look, if you want to have a good relationship with the EU, you need to fix your relationship with Poland. And he tried, actually. He came to Gdańsk for the 70th anniversary of the breakout of the Second World War, which was a denial of the Stalinist version of history that the war only started with the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. But then he saw that the Western canon of the Second World War basically blamed the Soviet Union for conspiring with Nazi Germany to start it. And the more anti-Western he became, the more he saw fit to challenge that, because you know, the victory in the Second World War is the one source of pride that all former Soviet citizens feel. And so he needed a scapegoat, which is why Russian school textbooks are falsified on this subject. It's interesting that Poland and Germany have been able to agree the facts of the Second World War. And on the basis of facts, you can have a reconciliation. The Germans and the Russians have not agreed the facts. So as far as I know, in the agreed textbook, there is a German version, which actually is the European version, namely that the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Ribbentrop-Molotov, directly led to the breakout of the Second World War, and the Russians have their version. And look, you know, we tried to reconcile with Russia on a similar basis as with Germany. Our churches met for the first time. We had a committee on difficult issues. The historians have agreed the facts, but it's the imperial propaganda that can't admit the facts, because Russia can't decide whether it's an aggressor or a victim. Difficult. You know, losing an empire is and de-imperializing your national memory is a very difficult thing to do, and Russia has not yet finished that process.
Well, to come back to Davis's excellent question about what is Germany pushing back against Moscow's revisionist history? No, it's not. I mean, that's the short answer. The slightly longer answer would be, for the very reason that I already mentioned in the beginning of our debate. I mean, there's a clear hesitation to challenge Russia about history in Germany for very clear historical reasons. But having said this, I do believe that, you know, a positive revision of Russian history happened in the early 90s under Yeltsin. There was a time when democratic parties in Russia were critically questioning anything that had been said in Stalinism and even after under the Communist Party's rule, and then, you know, in a step-by-step process, Putin undid even those steps of progress about history in Russia, to the point where today, the Dzień Pobjedy, the Victory Day, in Moscow with a huge parade just a couple of weeks ago, is used not only to basically justify Ribbentrop-Molotov and to justify Yalta, but also to justify aggression against Ukraine. You know, because the patterns used, the arguments used that were used in 39, in September 39 against Poland, and the arguments used in 1945 in extending their rule over half of Europe, actually disfiguring half a continent. It's something West Europeans still have a problem understanding, actually. But I mean, all this is today used against Ukraine. You know, it's an alleged fascist government. It's we need to help ethnic Russians. Ukraine is not a real nation. Well, all these things were said about Poland in 1939, and you know, that is the hideousness which needs to be called out even by a, let's say, perpetrator nation like Germany. And there shouldn't be any shame, and there shouldn't be any hesitation in calling this out. But unfortunately, there is.
May I just add a footnote while agreeing with Roland on everything? Just remember that the Russian National Day commemorates the expulsion of the Polish occupiers from the Kremlin in 1611. And the German historical attitude to Russia is also colored by the competition of paradigms. When I had my discussions with my then opposite number, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, today president of Germany, my paradigm would be, if we allow Putin to get away with occupying the Crimea and invading Ukraine, we don't know what he will do next. You know, the lesson of the 20th century is to react strongly to dictators. His lesson was, no, the lesson of the 20th century is that if you overreact the way Germany did in 1914, you are in danger of losing even more.
It's 14 versus 38, you know? I mean, these two narratives, like, is the worst possible thing an escalation that actually no one wanted in the beginning that ended up in a global catastrophe? Or is the worst possible scenario encouraging an aggressor by not pushing back against him in time and then getting a global catastrophe anyway? And probably even more drastically than it would have been if the aggressor had been stopped at an earlier point. I mean, the 38 versus 14 battle of narratives is huge, and I think we're going to see it again in the future. It's not the 2014, 1914, 2014, you know, Christopher Clark's book about the sleepwalkers played a huge role in Germany's debate in 2014 about Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Like, you know, the worst thing that can happen to us is sleepwalking into a disaster, as Martin Schulz put it in a speech in the European Parliament. And he used the word sleepwalking not coincidentally, because he knew that lots of Europeans, especially Germans, had read that book. It was the bestseller in 2013, the historical bestseller in Germany. Anyway, so this battle of narratives is extremely important, and I think we will see more of it in the future.
Thank you. Thank you both. And maybe just as an observation to add up on this, I mean, it's not only sometimes in Germany a misreading or misunderstanding of history. I mean, there's one phrase that always comes up, that our neighbor Russia. I don't know what maps some people use, but on my map, Poland is our neighbor and the Czech Republic, and there are some other states in between, but Russia is not our neighbor. But it shows maybe the sometimes ignorance when it comes to our Eastern European friends and partners. And I understand we have more questions from the audience.
Sure, it would not be an AJC panel without a question on Israel's security. So Germany has recently banned all of Hezbollah's activities on its territory. Do you think Germany could start and lead a discussion within the EU to ban Hezbollah in its entirety, not only its so-called military wing? And do you think that Germany would find partners in Central Europe, such as Poland? This question comes from Harriet from New York.
Well, I signed a European Parliament, a letter of MEPs to that effect. So in Poland is on the pro-Israel part of the spectrum in Brussels.
And the Martin Center tomorrow afternoon will have a closed shop, admittedly, but a debate with advisors and members of the European Parliament of the EPP group, with precisely this intention to structure the debate and think about ways how the EU could act much more decisively about the whole of Hezbollah, instead of this artificial separation between a so-called military wing and civilian wing or political wing, which of course doesn't exist in reality. So yes, but when it comes to the German government, I'm also pretty optimistic that on this point, I think the whole German government could be brought on board, and probably already is. I don't know exactly what's happening in Berlin right now, but this is something where I could see Germany and Poland indeed cooperate.
And do you see, maybe just as a follow-up question to both of you, could you see that Poland would be leading to that effect in Central Europe?
Not only in terms of MEPs or national members of parliament, which of course is appreciated, but in terms of governments, capitals, voicing the same position in Brussels.
Well, you'd have to ask the Polish government that. There were early hopes that Polish nationalists and Israeli nationalists will forge an alliance together, and then of course they found that the history divided them far more than they anticipated.
Thank you. So do we have, I guess we have more questions, Eric?
If we have
Maybe
time for
one last question here.
So Germany and Poland have their differences in relations to Trump and to some extent Putin. But what about their attitude towards China? Does Poland share the EU Commission/German position that China is a partner, but at the same time a systemic rival, and that the answer to China cannot be decoupling, but a strong and united EU? And this comes from Vladimir Handov in Prague.
Roland, or should I?
No, I go. Hi, Vladimir. Great question. I think a while ago, several years ago, this Polish government was still hoping to play geopolitical games, what I would call geopolitical games, with China's help. In other words, somehow, gaining a more independent foothold vis-a-vis Brussels, vis-a-vis Berlin, vis-a-vis Moscow, by somehow bringing in Chinese capital to the Belt and Road Initiative within the 17+1 China format, with several Eastern member states of the EU and also states in the Eastern neighborhood. So all these instruments seem to be lying on the table. But I think, first of all, there's been a big disappointment about the actual economic benefit of this kind of cooperation with China in Poland. And second, I do think that the Trump administration has at least suggested to the government in Warsaw that this kind of deep cooperation with China is not really in the interest of the West. And I think the mood has soured between Warsaw and Beijing already a year and a half ago, and it's been going downhill ever since.
That's probably correct, but it could be a missed opportunity. When we have our meetings with the Chinese, we joke that we only have one neighbor between us. And in the 1960s, not everybody knows this, communist Poland held several dozen secret meetings between the United States and People's Republic of China. And it was the meetings in Warsaw that led to the famous Nixon in China trip, and the decoupling, in fact, of China from the Soviet Union. It is not put it like this, it is overwhelmingly in Poland's interest for the United States to manage its difficult relationship with China peacefully. Because if it comes to something hot out there, then all of America's attention will be consumed by that, and then Russia will be able to sell its friendship to the West in that conflict. And that's a nightmare scenario for Poland. So Poland, provided it kept some fundamental credibility with both sides, would have an interest in managing the dialogue. You know, in Beijing, we have 2 hectares in downtown Beijing, much better embassy than Britain, the United States, or even Germany. Why? Because we recognized People's Republic of China already in 1947, and we had an exchange of plots. There's a lot of history there which could be used. Now, I was instrumental in organizing the first visit of the Prime Minister of China in Warsaw in 25 years, in the formula of 16+1. And there are 2 reasons for it, which I think make sense. First of all, most Central European states are just too small for China to deal with. You know, the Prime Minister of China is not going to go to Macedonia or Croatia, but was very glad to be able to meet them all in Warsaw. So Warsaw is a kind of hub, right? That makes sense. But the other reason Central Europeans are doing it, and this is uncomfortable for Western Europeans, is that West European countries have old industrial and commercial relations with China since before 1989, and they are not letting us into them. And they're jealous when we try to strike out on our own. The solution there is a solution to this, but it's an uncomfortable one for the West Europeans, namely to follow the Lisbon Treaty and to have a genuinely common foreign policy towards China. But the main members of the European Union are in breach of the Lisbon Treaty. They're not allowing the High Representative to lead on any important issue, including on China, where the major states pursue their own interests in parallel.
Well,
very briefly, Mr. Freudenstein.
To my mind, the overriding geopolitical conflict of the future, or global conflict of the future, is not a geopolitical competition between the United States and China. You know, this is the Thucydides trap and whatever you want to call it. The overriding global conflict of the next 20 years is liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. And authoritarianism was maybe led initially by a very, very punchy Russia under Putin. I think the cheerleader of the global authoritarian camp has very quickly become China at the moment. And the Corona crisis showed that very, very clearly. So this is not Western Europe versus Central Europe vis-a-vis China, or Europe as a whole and the United States vis-a-vis China. The global conflict is freedom versus authoritarianism versus autocracy. and it's absolutely clear where we stand on this. Germans, Poles, Canadians, Australians, Japanese, South Koreans, and of course, Americans. And I think there shouldn't be any doubt about positioning the European Union. And yes, of course, it would be nice to have a stronger high representative for the European Union. But I mean, here, all the big member states are guilty of reserving foreign policy still for their own countries and not delegating any powers to Brussels.
Thank you. And I really hate to be in the position ending this conversation, because a lot of viewers will agree that this was a fascinating discussion. And we, on behalf of AJC Central Europe and AJC Berlin, I want to thank you, Minister Sikorski, and you, Mr. Freudenstein, for taking the time out of your schedule. And again, this was a fascinating debate, and I could talk for another hour, but sadly we're limited. So again, thank you very much. And
thank you. Really thought-provoking.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
So Eric.
Yes, thank you once again to our panelists and guests for joining today's AJC Europe Connects call. Our next program, Jewish Identity and the Future of Europe, with Daniel Cohn-Bendit, will take place this Wednesday, July 8th at 4 p.m. Central European Time or 10 a.m. US Eastern Standard Time. To stay up to date on AJC programming, please check out our homepage at ajc.org/advocacy anywhere. We look forward to seeing you soon. Please take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye. Keep safe, everyone.